Quick question. Do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company owned devices and IT approved apps? I didn't think so. So, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at onepassword.com/XAM. That's onepassword.com/XAM.
Hi, I'm Jonna Johnson, CEO of Nemertes, here with my co-host.
John Burke, CTO of Nemertes.
And you're listening to Heavy Strategy, the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. And today we're going to be talking about something that both John and I are acutely familiar with, and many of you may be as well, which is analysis paralysis, or as John likes to put it, when is it time to stop thinking and start doing? And just to sketch out the challenge, if you're in IT, you basically take action largely when somebody tells you to take action, like, oh no, these users have a problem, or oops, the network crashed. If you have time for future planning, you're used to sort of sitting down at a desk and kind of chewing your pencil. Well, hypothetically chewing your pencil, because basically nobody uses actual pencils these days. But you're sitting there thinking about, and John is pulling out a pencil out of his pencil container.
with the Next Computing logo on it, the one pencil I keep.
And yes, that would be Jobs's second company. Anyway,
His Inter-Apple company between Apple and
Inter-Apple
Apple.
company. That's it. That's it. I love it when a guy gets fired from one job, from the company he started, then goes off and starts a new company, which is wildly successful, and then comes back to make his old company even more successful. It's always a good thing, and that must have felt very good to Jobs. But anyway, I digress, or we digress. Basically, what tends to happen is you'll be sitting there and you'll think about all the grand things you want to do. And in fact, I was just talking yesterday with a client who was complaining that the chief architect there tends to, really spend an awful lot of time thinking about what the architecture and strategy ought to look like, without necessarily getting feedback from the users and without really turning that into merging that in with the let's solve a problem in the here and now. And I think that happens a lot.
Absolutely, it does, and it's really easy to keep looking for a perfect solution that isn't going to bite you in the posterior later on, and lose sight of the fact that you actually have a problem to solve or a problem to head off. And so you really got to accept that there is not going to be a perfect solution, because there's never going to be a perfect solution. Even if it looks perfect now, it's not going to look perfect a year from now. So, that trying to tie down every loose end and trying to make sure that there's no possible hidden problem waiting for you, it's a mug's game.
It is, but I don't think anybody ever really is guilty of that. I mean, I think most of you guys listening on this are saying, you know what? I never do that. Sometimes I think too much and don't do enough, or sometimes I do too much and don't think enough. And that's why I'm listening to Heavy Strategy, to learn how to think more. But I don't think there's anybody that truly tries to solve every problem or boil the ocean.
Oh, you haven't worked in some of the IT shops I've worked in then.
Well, what I would suggest is that there's a 5 whys problem here, which is, it's not so much that they're really trying to boil the ocean. It's, why are they trying to boil the ocean? Because they haven't scoped the problem. And as funny as it sounds, I think scoping the problem is essential to determining exactly how much time and energy to spend doing the analysis, because you don't want to develop the perfect architecture, or even the perfect architecture for your organization, because that way, as one of my favorite YouTubers likes to put it, that way lies madness. What you do want to do is develop a good enough architecture and strategy that can be changed, as the IETF used to say, you want rough consensus and running code. It's close enough to what you want, and that you can move to making it work, and then see what the real problems are and see what the real issues are. And I think I think that scoping the problem is one of the top challenges to doing analysis effectively is kind of the way I would put it. Would you
Uh,
agree, John?
I can't argue with the absolute need for that. I will say though that folks who try and include heading off foreseeable problems with the chosen solution as a part of the scope, like if I put this in place, uh, what problems can I readily, rationally uh, foresee will arrive with it? um, if they try and solve all of those problems in advance, that can be a form of analysis paralysis because the environment in which it's going to be situated is going to be changing on an ongoing basis. If it takes you 6 months to figure out how to solve all the problems you saw at the outset, that's 6 months for more problems to arise or more problems to come into view. And so it can become an ever receding threshold, and other things become more important. They take priority. You put it aside, you come back to it. It's been another 6 months. You haven't been thinking about it. And now there's another 6 months worth of potential problems that have cropped up. So
Well,
I think
I'll jump in
scoping is
here.
important, but I think one of the issues in scoping is knowing that you're not going to have a solution for all of the potential problems when you start moving down the road.
Well, and I think that's a subset of scoping. And I
Yeah.
know we're quibbling over definitions, but
Yeah.
basically, I think one of the just to highlight a couple of themes that we've touched on right now. First of all, you want to think about what scoping is and think in terms of, let's borrow from agile, the agile methodology, minimum viable product. What is the minimum strategy I can get away with? What is the minimum architecture that I can get away with that is still viable? And I think where what the point you're bringing up, which is a very good one, John, I agree with it, is that sometimes the idea of minimum viable comes down to I must mitigate against every possible risk. And the reality is that's not sane. So quite a lot of risks you need to just sort of flag with a bit and say, this is a problem and we'll deal with it later if it happens. And that requires using a set of muscles that IT people don't normally have, which is prioritizing risks and kind of saying, yes, I could be in a world of hurt if I guessed wrong, but I'm going to guess anyway and keep going because the idea that you'll just proceed on a wrong guess is anathema to, doing good tight engineering, or at least it feels like it is.
Guessing feels like a bad word.
Yes.
We don't
Okay,
want to
if it
proceed
makes
on the
you
basis of a guess.
if it makes you feel any better, it's you're implementing and executing a Bayesian algorithm because that is what a Bayesian algorithm fundamentally is. It's take your best guess and move and then refine that guess. And as one of the best engineers of my acquaintance is fond of saying, a self-improving system is infinitely preferable to a perfect system. In other words, you're much better off if you start somewhere and improve as you go along than if you try to make it perfect from the get-go. And I think fully internalizing that is one of the key steps towards breaking away from analysis paralysis.
It's I always come back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on these things too. It's like there's the super evolving race, which instead of asking their neighbor at the table to pass the salt, would simply evolve into something with longer arms so that it could reach the salt for itself. Um, and the problem is that it then no longer needed or wanted the salt. So uh, one of the issues with overextending the analysis phase of any kind of project like this in IT is that you wind up pushing things out to the point where the problem has changed, and uh, the the company would no longer need the original solution to the original problem because that's no longer the problem. And just sitting around and waiting things out, on the one hand, saves you the work of actually solving the initial problem. On the other hand, it means the organization didn't have a solution to that problem and had to deal with it until it had to deal with a new one. So you're not serving the institution and you're not serving your IT department's reputation for being effective problem solvers, which is a good reputation to have.
Well, and that actually brings up another point, which is something that's always kind of amazed me about you is the way you think of yourself. I've always thought of you since as long as I've known you as like a really sharp guy in tech, science, all these interesting things. But in your mind, you're really about helping people. That's what you like to do. That's what motivates you. You're a nurturer. You're somebody who takes care of people and makes sure that they are as happy and contented as they can be in their environment. And that's how you're put together. And what I found is really weird is that that's actually true of a much broader swath of IT folks than I had realized. There's this image of us as being these kind of automatons probably with autism and no ability to connect with our fellow humans. There are some of us who are like that, I admit, but there's an awful lot of people who feel like my job is to help people. And what tends to happen is if you really want to help people, you don't want to be spending your day thinking about how you might help them in the future, because that's not giving you your emotional reward. Anytime you have a choice between helping somebody in the here and now and planning how you might help them in the distant future, you're going to do the here and now. And in IT, there's always somebody who needs help, whether it's a junior person who can get better training, or whether it's a user who has an immediate problem that you shouldn't be dealing with because you're the architect, but you can't resist stepping in, all those things.
There's certainly some truth in that. And the urge to help is what drives a lot of IT people to be in the part of IT that they're in. I myself, I started a help desk in one organization and helped build one in another one when that wasn't actually a part of my job. And it's good for IT to be solving people's problems in the here and now. But that technologist part of me also always wants to build a solution, build an environment where fewer people have those problems. And so there's this elimination of the unnecessary problems so you can get to the necessary ones, where the issue isn't that, something's broken, something doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, whatever, and is more like, I want to do this new thing and none of our systems do this new thing yet. Let's figure out how to do this new thing. That's a way more interesting problem to solve for people than just for the umpteenth time helping them remember that they just need to reboot their computer at least once a month so that it works properly.
Yeah. And I think, sort of circling back to this, I would say, so some of the challenge with analysis paralysis, if you're finding yourself stuck in that, just to repeat, you've been scoping the problem wrong. Try to think in terms of minimum viable problem to solve, so to speak.
Launch and correct.
Right. Launch and correct. And also don't try to resist the urge to mitigate against any possible thing that goes wrong. Just jot it down, flag it, and say, yes, we did think about it. No, we don't have a solution. We are prepared to confront it if and when that problem arises.
And distinguish between the project threatening level of we don't know how to fix that and this is going to be an ongoing annoyance level of problem.
Exactly. Spend some time flexing your muscles to tell those apart. But then I think there's also just the very human level, which is, and I have problems with this, and I know you do, John, but it's just an ongoing challenge, like staying fit or anything else. It's like, give yourself a maximum bandwidth of your day that you get to feel good by doing the things that make you feel good in the here and now, i.e. helping people, whether it's members of your own team, users, senior executives, whatever. You get to do that. You have to do that. If you're the kind of person where that fuels your engine, you have to get a minimum amount of fuel, but then carve out the bandwidth that addresses that future problem, even though it doesn't deliver the emotional payoff at that moment. It's going to, and it is fun and it is exciting and it is interesting. So just balance the bandwidth in each day. Say, okay, look, I've got an hour and a half where I'm going to make people feel good, and I'm going to spend 2 hours working on this, analyzing this problem. At a human level.
I am nodding vigorously in agreement, which you can't see because you're not watching. Let me throw this back into the mix, though. Analysis paralysis is a ruse sometimes. People will go into a perpetual analysis phase, not because they can't find their way out of it, but because they don't want to find their way out of it. And I know I've done it. I've watched other people do it. I've been the person it's been done to. And it is a long-standing tactic for stalling an initiative that you don't want to or don't think the organization is ready to commit to. So when middle management starts pushing things down on you, We need to study that more. We need to figure out how that's going to work with this or that or the other thing. And you can try and stall until it becomes a non-issue. And that's great. In my old jobs, we always used to talk about management by magazine. And the folks at the top level, the CIO, whoever, would be coming off a long flight from the West Coast, and they'd be full of ideas that they'd gotten from reading some in-flight magazine or Inc. or Fortune or something. And they'd be saying, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? And so we'd start studying those problems. And within usually a month, they had lost track of it entirely because it was just a passing fancy. And we had not kicked off an amazingly complicated project with dubious returns in response to that whim.
Let's pause for a message from today's sponsor, 1Password. Imagine your company's security is like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are the company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass to the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are the unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. And most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but lots of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. Check it out at onepassword.com/XAM. That's onepassword.com/XAM. And now back to the podcast.
Well, and I do agree with you on the whole notion it's a tactic. And sometimes it's a defensive tactic, like in your case, or sometimes it's an offensive tactic. When somebody wants to do something and you're standing in the way of doing something, they'll send you on a wild goose chase to go do some analysis on something else. And then they'll use the fact that you're doing all this analysis as the reason to slam in their solution. I remember working with a client, and I was absolutely not fond of the guy that did this. And later he was fired for something heinous like embezzlement, I think.
Ouch.
So my gut was correct. But basically, we were doing a very careful, very well planned out analysis for them of a particular type of security product. And here's the kicker. They knew they didn't have time and energy to do that kind of thing, the product selection stuff. And we have an offering where we can do the whole thing soup to nuts in about 6 weeks with them requiring about 3 hours of effort on their part. So they were smart enough to say, you know what, Namertes, here, go do this. And so we did. And what we realized was the guy that really, really wanted his particular product kept that product out of the analysis. So we came back and we had done this analysis, and the top 3 vendors we proposed were all great. And he was kind of like, well, yes, but there's this other vendor that while you guys were doing this, I've already signed a big deal with. Well, that was where the embezzlement or whatever it was came in. And we had kind of thrown him for a loop because he thought this whole project of vendor selection was going to take 6 months, and instead it took 6 weeks. So he had to move fast to get his kickbacks from the vendor. I think that's what it was, kickbacks from the vendor. In any event, yes, sometimes go do this analysis can be a tactic they send you on and it's usually for nefarious purposes. You know, anyone in a government bureaucracy knows, oh, well, let's convene a committee and assess that means basically we don't want it to happen. So the question then becomes, how do you stop that from happening? And I would say there's probably 2 ways to do it. One is not to do it at all. Don't stop. Sometimes you have to pick your battles. And it reminds me, one of my friends on LinkedIn, John Procap, had a meme yesterday that made me chuckle. It's like he said something like, sometimes I'm wise and have increased my wisdom with age, and other times I'm like, and the meme was like, you know, one character says to another, you have to pick your battles, and the other character goes, I pick them all. and I could see John doing that actually. But in any event, moving right along, sometimes you pick your battles, and if you can tell that somebody's sending you off on a wild goose chase, what you want to do is figure out, do I really care? Like, do I really care? Like, what's their ultimate goal here? And if they're just trying to drive something else through while I'm otherwise distracted, and I'm not really objecting to that other thing, then either take the bait and do the analysis knowing that you're basically serving somebody else's agenda, or just say, you know what? I don't know that we need to. Well, let's just sign off on the thing you really want to do because it probably isn't going to do too much damage to us and I can live with it. So that's one scenario. The other scenario is to call them on it and say, look, we've done a ton of analysis. At this point, we've got to either move forward or stop. And if you don't want to move forward, that's fine. But I want you on record as saying you do not want to move forward in this direction. And by on record, I mean, give me an email, give me give me a Teams message, give me something that I can screenshot and show senior executives when everything crashes and somebody says, why didn't you do X? And you can say, because so-and-so told us that they didn't want to do X. And here's the email or message in which they did. Sometimes you just have to call them on it. And that is just knowing your politics. And you're making faces, John. I don't think you agree with me 100%.
No, I was trying to not sneeze into the microphone.
There is that. And guess what? Guess what, friends? That's how you can tell that we are not an AI generated podcast. They never sneeze into the microphone.
Yeah, side note on sneezes, that. Though.
Side note on that, if you don't know already, Google LM or their Google's Notes LM or whatever they call it actually will generate a pretty credible podcast from data that you feed it. We fed it a report that was about 20 pages long, and it generated a very good summary of the report, but more interestingly, generated an almost credible podcast. And the only way you could tell that it wasn't a real podcast was, number one, the information density was incredibly low. We like to think we're better than that. And number two, there were absolutely no asides about what their friends had posted on LinkedIn or sneezing into the microphone.
Well, there was also the fact that they sounded soulless, like the worst version of pod people. Yeah.
Well, sometimes, sometimes even the best podcasters sound a little too NPR-ish. But that's, again, a side note. So coming back to this, I think the third item on analysis paralysis is you want to stop and think about, is it being used as a political weapon either by you, in which case carry on, or against you, in which case your choices are either play along or confront the person, depending on what the organization is and how important the issue is.
And I think that issue of importance is another important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about analysis paralysis, because sometimes you get stuck in the analysis phase because the importance of the thing you're studying just continually gets trumped by the importance of other things that are coming up and need to be dealt with either more urgently, or they are legitimately just more important, even if they're not urgent. And so things just get into this kind of holding pattern in the analysis where you never push it forward and you never bring it to an end. And there's no simple way to close that off effectively, except to give yourself hard deadlines. If we haven't made a decision on this by date X, then we're just putting this aside. And if it becomes a problem again in the future, we'll pick it up again with a fresh study. But we won't just keep this thing open and chewing up some of our time and attention indefinitely.
And in fairness, John, what you just said reminded me of something else. We do a lot of, coaching around how to develop an effective innovation strategy. And in fact, innovation strategies are, practically speaking, they're an example of this. And one thing that we found is that folks are great at the brainstorming part of the innovation strategy and terrible at the rest of the funnel, by which I mean deciding which ideas to follow through with and which ideas go on the shelf. And part of that is because once you've done the brainstorming, every idea is precious and you don't want to hurt it by rejecting it. I'm exaggerating, but it's kind of true. It's like very rarely is somebody going to say that's a really stupid idea. Sometimes they do just because they're curmudgeons, but more often it's like, well, I don't see that that's going to help us. But I can't say it's a dumb idea and I can't say that it won't. So what do I do with it? And one of the things that we've always recommended is that when you turn down an idea at any stage of the funnel, and there's multiple stages in the innovation funnel, but at any stage of the funnel, don't toss it on the floor and say, we thought about it and we're not going to do it. And that, by the way, is a bad corporate culture. If you're one of those corporate cultures where your answer to everything is, we thought about it and we're not going to do it, that's a bad thing. What you want to do is say, we considered it. It's not appropriate at this time under these circumstances. And if you can, spend a few more minutes asking yourself under what circumstances it would be appropriate. And I'll give you a very simple example. Many years ago, I had an idea for doing a videocast series that involved basically interviewing people and videotaping them while videoing them. And this was pre-COVID. And it turned out that the reason we didn't move forward with it was the technology for doing remote video wasn't as good as it needed to be for what we were trying to do. And basically, it would have been way too expensive with the travel costs and the video costs on top of that, on top of the video editing costs, which are always going to be there. And it just wouldn't have panned out. Well, we put it on the sidelines, and then we revisited it about 3 years later and discovered that it was still a great idea, but we had other ideas that took precedence. So again, we put it on the sidelines. So basically, the first time was the technology wasn't here. Second time, okay, technology is here. Let's have a look at it. Everything was good from a technology external perspective, but we internally had to focus on some other stuff. So we flagged it again, put it on the side, and said it is not quite in alignment with our internal strategy. Just recently, we pulled it up again and realized we had done most of the work of thinking about what was necessary for the project. And it was just a matter now of turning that slowly but surely into execution. So the point is, an idea that's a bad idea because the technology isn't available, or a bad idea because it's not yet in alignment with the corporate strategy, may become a good idea 5 or 6 years down the road. So don't just throw it out. Flag it with why you're not moving forward, and then put it on a shelf where you revisit it as part of your regular strategy. Let's look at all the ideas that we used to have and that we tossed out because one of them may turn out to be really useful.
If you think of it in those kind of loose DevOpsy terms, it's like having a backlog. And every now and then you revisit the backlog and see if things need to be reprioritized, moved up, and into the development loop instead of just sitting out there waiting to become important enough to do. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And not now is a very different answer from that's stupid never. And that's a pretty rare kind of an answer to get in IT these days.
And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's also one other way analysis paralysis steps into a situation, and that is when the folks involved are reluctant to make a major change from what they're familiar with, experienced with, professionally good at, into something that's new for them and new for the organization both, because that brings with it risks. And we were talking about risks earlier, but the risk of not being able to pick up the new skill set, the risks of not being able to execute the technology or the strategy well in your environment. And so introducing organizational risk, interfering with operations in some way, those can turn into a driver for staying in the analysis phase longer and longer.
I think that's an excellent observation, John. And the point I would raise here, a great example here is zero trust. It took me forever to realize why 5 or 7 years ago people weren't moving towards zero trust, because the products were out that were available, the technologies were available. And finally I realized, I remember being a very young engineer in my early 20s, giving a talk to a bunch of senior CIOs in Southern California about firewalls. And I had to explain what a firewall was. And side note, I used an example of a fertility technology, just to keep it G-rated, and I said, nothing goes in, nothing crosses the barrier is what I said. And I realized as a, 20-year-old female engineer talking to a bunch of 50-year-old males, that was probably not the right example to use. But that's why it's stuck in my head, because I remember standing there at the podium going, oh crap, this is on my slide, so I have to say it. But the point is, I realized that anyone who was my age, is, or maybe just a little bit older. Let's say you were in your 30s and you decided you were going to get really smart on these firewalls, because firewalls was what it took to do cybersecurity for 25 years. Well, guess what? By the time you are now at the end of your career, you're the CISO, you want to go out on a bang. You don't want to be the guy or gal that brought this new thing, zero trust, in and broke security. So you're thinking literally, you know what? I think it's a great idea, and I'm not going to be the one to implement it. I've got another 5 years to retirement, so I'm just going to sit here and get better firewalls and let the next person deal with the risk of zero trust. And that was literally happening. People had decided, had made the actual decision that they were just going to keep working with what worked. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and let it get fixed on the next guy's watch.
Even though it was very obviously broken and not working.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what has managed to change that was, first of all, a bunch of those CISOs did retire. Second of all, you had a lot of federal mandates saying you must be implementing zero trust. So even if you're not really doing it, you have to make it look like you're doing it. And at some point, the effort of making it look like you were doing it, kind of paled in comparison or exceeded the effort required to do it. And the third thing that happened was the firewall vendors, finally realized that they needed to embrace this or become obsolete. So you have the Palo Altos of the world, really becoming leaders in zero trust, which all makes sense. But again, that there was a period of 5 to 7 years where there was complete analysis paralysis and people would just keep analyzing it so that they wouldn't have to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I think there's still a lot of folks in that phase where it's like, oh yeah, we implemented ZTNA for all of our remote workers. And then you ask them what they're doing about the rest of zero trust, because it's everywhere. It's not just in between your remote workers and your services. And oftentimes there's just a long silence in response to that. Zero trust in between my servers and the data centers and clouds? Nope, not doing that.
Well, John, what do you think is a good example of analysis paralysis in the here and now? I mean, zero trust is an almost obsolete example, although there's still components that are, as you just said, valid. I'm thinking about this as well. I would
Post-quantum encryption. A lot of folks. I mean,
yes.
it's relatively new stuff as far as trusted algorithms for being there, but most of the planning could have been done just waiting for the right algorithms to be dropped in place. And in fact, that hasn't happened. And instead, folks were waiting for some post-quantum algorithms to be put out there to sit around for a while, not being shown to be ineffective before they even started to thinking about making a plan to shift. So I think they're even in the early phase of analysis paralysis, and it's going to be a while because they've got a lot of layers of encryption in their infrastructures that are going to have to be touched up, and they're probably, if they just sit down and think about it, realizing they don't even know all the places in their infrastructure and service architecture that encryption is happening and in a non-quantum safe way.
Well, and let's flag that conversation because I think you've just opened up a whole can of worms that is well worth talking about. So let's flag that for a future episode.
Yeah.
And since we're pretty much out of time, thank you for joining us today. If you've got feedback or a follow-up and you really want to hear about post-quantum encryption or you really don't want to hear about post-quantum encryption, please send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We definitely want to hear what you think. And if you've got a story about analysis paralysis, we'd love to hear that too. We do not have to know your name. We don't have to blow your cover, but we'd love to tell the story. So if you want to talk to John or myself, please reach out to us at nemertes.com. That's N like Nancy, EM like Mary, ERTES.com. And we look forward to hearing from you.